It was just past noon in Broughton, Mississippi. The heat hadn't yet settled into the cracks of the old town, but the tension had inside the modest diner. Ceiling fans spun lazily above tables of regulars, their quiet routines not disturbed by much, except for the occasional murmur of conversation or the clink of cutlery on plates. The air, thick with the low hum of the fans, carried an undertone of curiosity that seemed to settle every time the door opened. The diner was where time slowed down, where everyone knew everyone. And the outside world seemed like a distant memory, until he walked in. A tall black man in a sharp suit under a light jacket. No company, no visible badge, just a small leather folder tucked beneath one arm. His presence was enough to disrupt the usual calm. He moved with purpose, but it was a quiet purpose, one that didn't scream for attention, yet demanded it all the same. The flicker of eyes in his direction was brief, but deliberate. No one said a word, but the quiet hum of the diner shifted, just slightly as he entered. Officer Kelly Flint, a 29-year-old third-generation cop, had grown accustomed to the rhythms of Broughton. He'd seen his fair share of quiet afternoons, and he'd learned how to read the usual crowd in places like this. The regulars, the old men discussing the weather, the couples in booths whispering behind coffee mugs, the teenagers sneaking in to buy sodas and share laughs. But this man, this black man sitting alone at a corner booth, watching, writing, and reading, he didn't fit into any of those categories. Flint's eyes narrowed as he stepped through the door, the warm air of the diner brushing against his face, feeling heavier than usual. He spotted the man immediately, his instinct kicking in, and something inside him clicked into gear. It was as if the quiet hum of the room had suddenly turned into a warning siren, only he was the only one who seemed to hear it. He approached. Cautiously, trying to keep his cool, the man didn't look up as he walked closer, as if he were lost in his world. Flint stopped, just a few feet away from the table, hovering there for a moment, watching the man's calm movements. He adjusted his duty belt, squared his shoulders, and with his usual air of authority, asked, "You waiting for someone, sir?" The man didn't flinch. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was measured and calm. "No, just having lunch." Flint nodded slowly, taking in the scene. It wasn't the lunch that had drawn him in, though. It was the man's presence. Something about him felt different, out of place, even in a small town like Broughton. Flint leaned in slightly, noticing the faded emblem sticking halfway from the leather folder mistakable. Federal investigation. The words flashed in his mind before he could stop them. "You work for the feds?" he asked, his voice a little sharper now. The man, who had been quiet up until then, slowly lifted his eyes to meet Flint's. The calm in his gaze didn't falter. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the folder with deliberate care. As though he had all the time in the world, his movements slow and controlled. "I'm not wearing a uniform, officer. But yes, I'm here on official business." "And that, sir, is a matter of fact," the man replied. The confidence in his tone made Flint feel like he had just stepped into a much bigger situation than he had expected. Flint took a step back, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't just another routine check. Something felt off. And he wasn't sure if it was the man's calmness or the way he'd just addressed him with no hint of fear or respect. It didn't sit right. There was something underneath this. His instincts were telling him to dig deeper. Without thinking, he grabbed his radio, his hand hovering over the button. Unit 3, requesting backup to the diner. Possible fraudulent. ID. Subject possibly recording or inciting, he said, his voice betraying just a touch of uncertainty. But in that moment, he didn't care. His gut told him to call for backup, to be sure, even if his mind was unsure of why. The man Elise, Rowe, a federal investigator, didn't react to the call. Instead, he closed the folder slowly, almost as though Flint's actions didn't matter. His eyes locked onto the officers with a steady intensity that felt like a challenge. "Making a mistake, officer?" Elise said calmly, his voice cutting. Through the thick silence that followed, Flint's hand trembled slightly as he looked around the diner. The manager shot him a nervous glance, and the white couple 2 booths over shifted uncomfortably. One of them muttered, "He does look out of place." Flint immediately pointed in their direction, trying to justify his own growing unease. See, it's not just me. Elise didn't blink. He stared back at Flint, unblinking, unfazed by the growing tension. His voice remained calm, precise, and without hesitation. Your gut isn't the law, and your suspicion isn't probable cause. Flint grinned, though it didn't reach his eyes. You going to lawyer me now? He mocked, his pride beginning to take over. Elise's expression remained unchanged. I don't need to. But you seem to be forgetting something, officer. Your instincts might be enough to keep you on the job, but they won't hold up when the truth comes out. The silence between them stretched even longer now. The hum of the fans, the clinking of silverware, the occasional murmur of voices, none of it reached either of them. Elise was no longer just another diner patron. He was a challenge to Flint's world, and that challenge was about to expose everything that Broughton had tried so hard to keep hidden. The tension in the diner felt almost tangible now. The air was thick with suspicion, and all eyes seemed to settle on Elise Rowe and Officer Flint. The regulars, who usually shared quiet meals, now sat in awkward silence, their glances flickering between the two. The waitress nervously wiped down a counter, avoiding eye contact, as if her actions could somehow absolve her from the discomfort swirling around her. But no one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft whirl of the ceiling fan, spinning relentlessly above, as if it could blow away the mounting tension in the room. Elise's gaze never wavered from Flint's, the calm in her eyes unwavering, her composure untouched by the chaos brewing around them. She was a force, and she knew it. Flint, on the other hand, was slowly beginning to realize he had underestimated the situation. The man who had walked into the diner wasn't just some lone outsider. He was a federal investigator. Someone with authority that reached far beyond the small town of Broughton. Elise had made it clear, with just a few words, that she wasn't there to play by the same rules as the town's police force. But Flint didn't back down. Still, he said, his voice tight, his hands hovering near his duty belt. If that badge is real, he sneered, why are you here alone? Where's your backup? The question was a challenge, and Elise wasn't the type to shy away from a challenge. She didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she simply leaned back in her seat. Her posture relaxed but authoritative, because, she said slowly, her voice cutting through the silence, I don't need backup to have lunch. The words were simple, but they were more than just a reply. They were a statement of power. Flint's expression faltered just for a second, but that was enough. He had been trained to assert control, to question the unfamiliar, and to view anyone who didn't belong as a potential threat. But Elise wasn't a threat. She was a revelation. And he didn't know how to handle that. The doors of the diner opened once more, and Chief Lillian Crum entered, her presence filling the room. Crum was a woman who had spent years making sure things in Broughton stayed quiet. She was an enforcer of the status quo, and she had worked hard to keep the town's darker secrets hidden beneath layers of protection. But now, standing in front of Elise, she realized her grip on that control was slipping. Which one of you thinks you're federal? Crum's voice was low, but her sarcasm was sharp. She didn't look at Flint for confirmation, but rather addressed Elise directly, sizing her up as if she were a threat to the established order. Elise didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into her folder, pulling out a single piece of paper. She slid it across the table with deliberate care, not saying a word, as Crum's eyes fell to it. I don't think I'm federal, Elise said quietly. I am, and this is your copy. Crum's eyes narrowed as she picked up the document. It wasn't just any piece of paper. It was a subpoena signed by a federal judge attached to a sealed indictment. The words on the paper had the power to dismantle everything Crum had worked to protect. What the hell is this? Crum asked, her voice losing a bit of its edge as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The calmness in Elise's voice, the confidence in her actions, were slowly beginning to crack Crum's steely exterior. This, Elise replied, her gaze never leaving Crum's.
What is the end of your cover?
There was a pause, a beat of silence in the room as Crum processed what Elise was saying. She looked down at the document in her hands, but she wasn't seeing it yet. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out how to maintain control, how to brush this off, but it was too late for that. "I'll tell you what it is, Crumb," Elise continued, her voice steady. "It's a list of crimes you've been covering up for years. Unauthorized wiretaps, body cam footage mysteriously erased, payments from untraceable funds to intimidate witnesses." She let the words hang in the air, one after the other, like punches in a fight. "You don't have anything," Crumb spat, trying to hold on to her bravado. "This is nothing." But Elise wasn't done. "Shall I continue?" she asked, her voice smooth as she flipped to another page in her folder. Testimony from a former deputy, bank records showing off book transfers, texts between you and known criminal intermediaries. Each new revelation was a piece of the puzzle falling into place, exposing the corruption Crumb had been hiding for years. The room seemed to hold its breath as Crumb's face shifted from disbelief to anger. She knew Elise knew that. There was no escaping the truth that had been unearthed. Her hands clenched into fists as Elise flipped to the next page, and with a quiet resolve, she began listing the violations. Civil rights violations, witness tampering, misuse of public funds, and obstruction of justice. The list was long, and it was damning. "The Department of Justice has already confirmed jurisdiction," Elise said, her words cutting through the room like a knife. "This is the end for you, Crumb. It's over." Crumb wasn't ready to surrender yet. She was a woman who had spent her life holding on to power, and she wasn't about to let go so easily. "In this town, do you really think that's going to hold?" she asked, her voice tight with defiance. Elise didn't flinch. "It's not about what you think," she replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "It's about what's coming next." With a single motion, Elise pulled out the arrest warrant federally sealed, a final piece of the puzzle that Crumb couldn't ignore. "Dale Crumb," Elise said, her voice cutting through the silence, "you are under arrest."
Ow.
The room went. Still, Crumb's mouth opened, but no words came out. She was trapped, and she knew it. Her world, built on corruption and lies, was falling apart in front of her eyes. Elise had come for the truth, and now she had it. There was no escaping it, and in that moment, it became clear. Broughton was never going to be the same again. The silence in the diner felt suffocating now. It wasn't just the stillness in the room that gripped the atmosphere, it was the weight of what had just happened. Chief Crumb, her face still twisted with disbelief, stood frozen as she stared at the arrest warrant on the table. Elise Rowe remained calm, her eyes unwavering, her posture steady. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to argue. The truth was on the table, and it was undeniable. But Crumb wasn't ready to concede. She looked down at the warrant again, then back up at Elise. The facade of authority she had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling, and she could feel it. She had built a reputation in Broughton, one that ensured her control over the town's police department and kept things under wraps for years. But now, everything was unraveling, and she had no way of stopping it. "What do you think this is going to do?" Crumb sneered, her voice low, barely concealing her panic. "Do you really think I'll just walk out of here in handcuffs because of a piece of paper?" Elise didn't flinch. She had seen this before. People who were used to power didn't give it up easily. They fought until the very end, clinging to the illusion that they could control everything. But Elise wasn't here for a fight. She was here to end the silence. To expose the rot that had festered in this town for far too long. "You won't be walking anywhere." "Crumb," Elise replied evenly, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. Behind Elise, the door to the diner creaked open again. 3 U.S. Marshals stepped into the room, their badges gleaming under the dim light. Their presence was undeniable, a force that made everyone in the room stop and take notice. Crumb's face paled, her confidence slipping away like sand through her fingers. She was no longer the one in control. The weight of the federal investigation had descended upon her like a hammer. "This is a federal operation," one of the marshals said, his voice firm, unyielding. "You are in our custody." Crumb opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked around the diner as if she were searching for a way out. The waitress, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, stepped back, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. A couple of patrons who had been sitting in the booths had shifted in their seats. Their eyes were now locked on Crumb. Even the couple who had earlier backed Flint remained silent, out there, gaze fixed on the events that were unfolding in front of them. Crumb's eyes darted from the marshals to Elise and back again. She knew it was over. Her arrogance, her control, all of it had been shattered in an instant. The quiet little town of Broughton, where secrets were buried and corruption was ignored, had just been exposed to the harsh light of truth. The marshals moved in swiftly, securing the scene and making sure all the evidence Elise had collected was gathered and taken into custody. There was no room for mistakes now. Broughton was no longer a place where things could be swept under the rug. The truth had been laid bare, and it wasn't going anywhere. As they moved to take Crumb into custody, Elise stood silently, watching as the woman who had once held the town in her grip was led away in handcuffs. There was no satisfaction on Elise's face, no moment of triumph. She had come for justice, not for recognition. The real work had just begun, but in that moment, as Crumb was escorted out of the diner, the tension in the room began to dissolve. The regulars, who had watched in stunned silence, started to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The air that had once felt thick with fear now felt slightly lighter. People were talking again, but the conversations were quieter now, as if the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. Elise remained where she was, her hands resting calmly on the table, her gaze fixed on the door. She wasn't in a hurry to leave. This town, this diner, it would never be the same again. And that was exactly what she had come here to do. Officer Flint stood by the window, his back turned to her, his hands resting on the sill. His face was pale, his eyes distant. He had watched everything happen in real time, his whole worldview unraveling before his eyes. Elise knew what was going through his mind. He had always been loyal to the badge, to the system. But the system had failed him, just like it had failed the people of Broughton. The cracks in the armor were too big to ignore now. "Flint," Elise said quietly. Breaking the silence between them, he didn't turn around at first, as if he were, trying to figure out whether he had the courage to face her. But finally he did, his eyes meeting hers, filled with something between shame and confusion. "I didn't know," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't know about any of this." Elise didn't offer him an immediate response. She simply nodded, as if to acknowledge the truth of his words. He hadn't known, but now he did. The question wasn't whether he knew any more, it was what he was going to do with that knowledge. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "But you do now, and that's what matters." Flint opened his mouth, as if he were about to say something, but stopped himself. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. The weight of the truth was too much to bear in. That moment, Elise turned back to the door, her mind already focused on the next step in her investigation. There was still much to do. The arrest of Chief Crumb was only the beginning. Real work was in the follow-through, in ensuring that the system would be held accountable. Elise wasn't interested in a quick victory. She was here to change things for good. As she stood up from the table and made her way toward the door, Flint called after her one last time. His voice cracked slightly, the words coming out as if they were too difficult to say aloud. "Do you think this is really going to change anything?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of doubt and resignation. Elise paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. She didn't turn around, but her voice carried a sense of finality. "It's a start," she said. "That's all we can do. Start." With that, she stepped out of the diner, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The town of Broughton, once untouched by the truth, was now awake, and the echoes of her footsteps reverberated through the streets, carrying with them the promise of change. The aftermath of the arrest settled like a heavy fog over Broughton. The streets, usually quiet and unassuming, were now alive with the hum of change. Elise Rowe had left the diner, but the ripples of her actions reverberated through the town. The echoes of Chief Crumb's arrest weren't just felt by the regulars in the diner. They spread through the very fabric of Broughton. For the first time, the town was forced to reckon with what had been hidden in the dark corners for years. "Elise," Didn't stay for the media frenzy. She didn't need the cameras, the interviews, or the spotlight. For her, justice wasn't about recognition. It was about action. She had uncovered the rot, but the work wasn't done. Truth, but now it was time to make sure it stuck. Town wasn't going to change overnight. Broughton had spent years under the thumb of people like Crumb, and now the real work was about dismantling that system. Brick by brick, back at the police station, Flint sat alone in an empty conference room. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and distant. The silence around him was suffocating. He could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the rustling of papers in the next room, but none of it reached him. His mind was still trying to make sense of what had just happened. A federal investigator had come to town, uncovered a web of corruption, and exposed everything he thought he understood about his job. The town that had been a sanctuary for his family and his legacy had been shattered in an instant. And it wasn't just the town's reputation that was on the line. It was his career, his father's legacy, and his grandfather's too. He wasn't just a cop. He was part of a lineage that had served Broughton for generations. His pride, his identity had been built on the badge he wore. But now, the badge felt heavy, like an anchor dragging him under. Elise's words kept playing in his mind, her calm tone cutting through his confusion. Your gut isn't the law, and your suspicion. His improbable cause? He'd always trusted his instincts, but in the end, it wasn't enough. He had been wrong. Flint. A voice called from the doorway. Breaking his thoughts, Flint looked up to see Chief Crumb standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. For a moment he thought he might have imagined it, his mind still reeling from the events of the day. But there she was. A woman who had just been arrested and was now standing in front of him as if nothing had happened. I thought you might be in here, Crumb said, her voice low, almost calculating. Her eyes were empty, like someone who had already given up on everything. Flint didn't respond immediately. He didn't know what to say. His world had been turned upside down, and now Crumb was standing there, as if she still had control. The arrest, the revelations, none of it seemed real anymore. But it was real, and that terrified him. I can't believe it, Flint finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought it would go this far. Crumb didn't sit down. She stood there, arms crossed, looking at him with a strange mixture of resignation and bitterness. You were always one of the good ones, Flint. You were loyal, she said. But sometimes loyalty blinds you to the truth. Flint flinched at her words. It felt like a slap, even though she had said it quietly, almost casually. He wasn't ready to accept what had happened, but there was no denying it now. The truth had come to light, and he was forced to face it, no matter how hard it was. I didn't want to believe it, Flint murmured, looking down at the floor. I didn't want to believe that everything we built here was built on lies. Crumb gave a bitter laugh. You think you're the only one who didn't see it? She stepped closer to him, her voice soft but menacing. The system isn't built on truth. It's built on control. And when people like you and me get too close to that control, they take it away. You think you're the victim here? You're not. We're all just cogs in the machine. Flint shook his head. I don't know if I can keep doing this, he said quietly. His voice was raw, his words laced with doubt. I can't be a part of this anymore. Crumb's eyes hardened. You think Elise Rowe is going to fix everything? She's just one person. Flint. One person can't change a system that's been in place for decades. You're naive if you think she's the answer. Flint stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. He was done listening to Crumb, the woman, who had manipulated everyone around her, who had destroyed lives and protected her own, was no longer someone he wanted to hear from. He had seen the evidence, heard the stories, and now he knew the truth. He had spent his entire life believing in something that wasn't real. It was time to face it. I don't care what you think anymore, Crumb, Flint said, his voice steady now, filled with determination. I'm going to do what's right. Won't be a part of this anymore. I'm going to help them. Crumb's expression darkened, but she didn't say anything more. She knew she had lost him. Flint wasn't the same man who had walked into that diner just hours earlier. He had seen the truth, and there was no going back from it. As Flint made his way out of the conference room, he found himself standing in front of the diner, looking out at the streets of Broughton. The town was quiet, as it always had been, but now there was an underlying current of change that he couldn't ignore. He knew this was just the beginning. The work Elise had started would continue. Broughton would never be the same again. Elise had left the town behind. But her presence lingered in every corner, in every conversation, and in every thought. She had shaken the very foundations of what people had believed to be true, and now there was no turning back. The town of Broughton had been forced to confront its own demons, and the people who had once stayed silent now had a choice. Would they continue to accept the lies, or would they demand the truth? Flint's thoughts were interrupted as a car pulled up in front of him. He turned to see a familiar face, one he hadn't expected to see again so soon. It was Elise. Stepped out of the car, her posture confident, her eyes scanning the town she had left behind. She didn't say anything at first, but the weight of her presence was enough. "I told you," Elise said softly, her voice carrying a quiet power. "This is just the beginning." Flint nodded slowly, his mind finally starting to accept the gravity of everything that had happened. The work was far from over. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was on the right side of history. The streets of Broughton were quiet, but the silence was different now. It was no longer a quiet resignation, the kind that had settled over the town for years. It was a tense, expectant silence, a town holding its breath, unsure of what the future held. The ripple effects of Chief Crumb's arrest had shaken every corner of Broughton, and no one was sure how to respond. Elise Rowe hadn't returned to Broughton for the accolades, nor the headlines. She wasn't interested in basking in the recognition. The job was never about that. For her, it had always been about exposing the truth, about dismantling the machinery that kept people silent, the system that protected the powerful while crushing the weak. She had come to Broughton for answers, and she had found them. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Broughton would take time to heal. The corruption that had wormed its way into every aspect of the town's government, law enforcement, and social systems couldn't be cleaned up in a day. But Elise had made the first incision, and now it was up to others to carry the weight of the change. After her work in the diner, Elise had left, leaving Broughton's fate in the hands of the very people who had been oppressed by the system for so long. The townspeople were the true power now. They had been silent for too long, but now they had a voice, and they weren't about to let it be silenced again. Flint had been caught in the middle of it all. A man who had spent his life believing in the system, in the badge, only to have his world collapse when faced with the truth. He had always believed in the righteousness of his work, in the honor of being a police officer. But now, after witnessing the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight, he could no longer ignore the truth. He walked the streets of Broughton, trying to make sense of it all. His footsteps echoed in the quiet streets, a man who had once walked with certainty but now moved with doubt. The weight of his family's legacy pressed heavily on him. His father had worn the badge, his grandfather before him. They had served Broughton for decades, keeping the peace, maintaining order. But their legacy was tainted. Lint's legacy was. Now tainted, there was no going back to the way things had been, but there was still work to be done. Elise had left, but she had left him with a choice. He could turn away from the truth and continue to live in the comfortable lies he had always known. Or he could face it, accept it, and work to change things. It wasn't going to be easy. It would take time. But for the first time, Flint felt like he was on the right path. He didn't know what his future held, but he knew he couldn't go back to the way it was, couldn't stay silent anymore. As he walked, he found himself at the town square, near the same diner where everything had started. He stopped in front of the building, his hand resting on the cool metal of the door. His eyes lingered on the space where Elise had sat, where the